Welcome back to the show, everyone. Today, we're diving into a fascinating topic that's been debated by philosophers for decades, the relationship between power, knowledge, and discourse. Thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here. I'm excited to discuss these crucial concepts with you and our listeners.
So, let's start with the basics. Imagine you're explaining these ideas to someone who's never heard of Foucault or Habermas. How would you describe their main differences?
That's a great way to start. Both thinkers are interested in how power shapes our world, but they have very different perspectives. Foucault, who was very interested in history, saw power as a kind of invisible force that's always at work, even in the most ordinary things. He believed that power doesn't just control us through force, but also by shaping what we think is true, normal, or even possible.
So, power isn't just about someone being in charge, but about how our whole society is structured.
Exactly. Foucault would say that power is woven into the fabric of our institutions, our language, and even our own identities. He used the term episteme to describe this underlying framework of knowledge, which changes over time and reflects the dominant power relations of a particular era. Think of it like a set of invisible rules that shape how we understand the world.
That's a lot to take in. Can you give me an example of what Foucault might be talking about?
Sure. Imagine a prison. Foucault would argue that the design of the prison itself, with its constant surveillance and strict rules, is a way of exercising power. It's not just about keeping people locked up, but about shaping their behavior and making them feel like they're always being watched. He even analyzed how the shift from public executions to prisons was a change in how power was exercised, moving from a spectacle of punishment to a more subtle form of control.
That's a really interesting way to think about it. But what about Habermas? How does he see power differently?
Habermas, who was more focused on how we communicate and how we can create a more just society, believed that power can be legitimate when it's based on consensus and agreement. He saw power as something that should be used to help people and to create a society where everyone has a voice.
So Habermas is more optimistic about the possibilities of power, while Foucault is more skeptical?
That's a good way to put it. Habermas believed that through open and honest dialogue, people could come to a shared understanding of the world and work together to create a more equitable society. He believed that power should be exercised through rational communication and consensus, not through force or manipulation.
This is all really fascinating, but it can be a little overwhelming. Let's try to break it down a bit more. Can you explain the difference between legitimate and illegitimate power in a way that's easier to understand?
Sure. Think about a government. Legitimate power would be a government that is elected by the people and that acts in the best interests of its citizens. Illegitimate power would be a government that uses force or coercion to stay in control, even if it's not what the people want. A good example of this would be a dictatorship where a single person holds power through force and intimidation, rather than through the consent of the governed.
That makes a lot more sense. So Habermas is more interested in how we can create a society where power is used for good, while Foucault is more concerned with how power can be used to control and manipulate people.
That's a great summary. Both thinkers are important because they help us to understand the complex ways that power operates in our world. They also help us to see how power can be used for both good and bad purposes.
It's amazing how much we can learn just by thinking about how power works. Let's move on to knowledge. How does each thinker view the relationship between knowledge and power?
Foucault believed that knowledge is never neutral. It's always shaped by the power relations of the time, and it's often used to maintain those power relations. He would argue that even scientific knowledge, which we often think of as objective, is influenced by power. For example, the way we understand mental illness has changed over time. And those changes have often reflected the power structures of the time. The way we define madness or criminality is not just a neutral scientific classification. but a reflection of the power dynamics of a particular society.
So, knowledge isn't just about discovering facts, but also about how those facts are used to control people.
Exactly. Foucault would say that knowledge is a tool that can be used to legitimize power, to create categories of people, and to define what's considered normal or abnormal. Think about the history of medicine. The way we treat illnesses has changed over time, and those changes have often been driven by power structures. For example, the rise of the asylum in the 18th century was a way of controlling and isolating people who were considered mad.
That's a really powerful idea. What about Habermas? Does he agree with this perspective?
Habermas, while acknowledging that power can influence knowledge, believes that reason and communication can help us to challenge those power structures. He believes that through open and honest dialogue, we can critically examine knowledge claims and work towards a more just society. He sees knowledge as a tool for liberation, not just for control.
So, Habermas is more optimistic about the potential for knowledge to be used for good, while Foucault is more skeptical.
That's a good way to put it. Both thinkers recognize the importance of discourse, or the way we talk about things, in shaping our understanding of the world. Foucault, however, sees discourse as a site of power struggles, where dominant groups control the production and dissemination of knowledge. He would argue the way we talk about things can be used to reinforce existing power structures and to silence dissenting voices.
So even the way we use language can be a form of power?
Absolutely. Think about how certain groups or ideas are often marginalized or silenced in public discourse. Foucault would argue that this is a reflection of power dynamics at work. For example, the way we talk about gender, sexuality, or race can often reflect and reinforce existing power structures.
That's a really important point. So how does Habermas see discourse?
Habermas, on the other hand, emphasizes the potential for discourse to be a tool for achieving consensus and fostering mutual understanding. He believes that through open and honest dialogue, individuals can overcome power imbalances and reach a shared understanding of the world. He sees discourse as a way to create a more just and equitable society.
It sounds like they both agree that discourse is important, but they have different ideas about how it functions.
Precisely. Their contrasting perspectives are deeply rooted in their shared historical context. Both emerged in the 1960s, a period marked by social and political upheaval. The student protests of 1968 in France, which deeply influenced Foucault, and the German student movement, in which Habermas actively participated, fueled their interest in the relationship between power, knowledge, and social change.
So their ideas are shaped by the times they lived in.
Absolutely. Foucault, influenced by the events of 1968, sought to understand how power operates through social structures and practices, particularly in institutions like prisons, hospitals, and schools. He explored how power shapes our understanding of ourselves and the world, often through subtle and insidious means. His work, therefore, reflects a deep skepticism towards traditional notions of power and a desire to uncover its hidden mechanisms.
And what about Habermas?
Habermas, deeply engaged in the German student movement, focused on the potential for reason and communication to challenge power structures and achieve a more just society. He believed that through open and undistorted communication, individuals could overcome the inequalities and injustices inherent in capitalist society. His work, therefore, reflects a strong belief in the power of reason and communication to create a more equitable and just society.
So they both came from a time of great change, but they focused on different aspects of that change.
Exactly. Their contrasting perspectives offer valuable insights into the complex relationship between power, knowledge, and discourse. While their approaches differ significantly, both thinkers provide crucial tools for understanding the dynamics of power in contemporary society and for exploring the potential for social change.
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. There's been a truly insightful conversation.
It's been my pleasure. I hope our listeners have gained a deeper understanding of these important concepts.
Now, before we go, let's bring this back to our everyday lives. How can we apply these ideas to the world around us?
That's a great question. Foucault's work reminds us to be critical of seemingly neutral institutions and practices, recognizing how they can shape our understanding of the world and ourselves. For example, we can think about how the media we consume, the education system we experience, or even the language we use can be influenced by power structures.
So we should be more aware of how these things might be shaping our thinking.
Exactly. And Habermas's work reminds us of the importance of critical thinking and open dialogue in challenging power structures and achieving a more just society. We should be asking questions, engaging in constructive conversations, and working towards a more equitable world.
That's a great takeaway. It's important to be aware of how power operates in our lives, to be critical of knowledge claims, and to engage in meaningful dialogue. Thank you again for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure. Until next time, keep exploring.